do next?
So then, from out of nowhere, a huge tidal wave lifted me, tossed me like a cork, and I found myself right on top of him, face to face with the blowhole. I could barely see from the waves crashing down upon me, but I knew something was there. So I reached my hand in, felt around, and pulled out the obstruction.
A couple of months ago, I was bumbling across Reddit and I stumbled across a clip to a new show that started recently. It obviously wasn't Seinfeld, I just thought it would make for a good opening. But one thing this show has in common with Seinfeld is that it used a laugh track. An incidental thing, really, I didn't give it all that much thought. But then I looked at the comments, always a smart move, and saw that a majority of them were dismissing the clip entirely because of the laugh track's presence. Upon going back and listening to it again, I'll say that yeah, as far as laugh tracks go, it wasn't very well implemented, mostly by using repeated audio clips and using it far too frequently. What caught me a bit more by surprise was how everyone was treating the concept of the laugh track. And as of relatively late, I'm talking like the last few decades here, there seems to have been a change in the public perception of them. These days, you're way less likely to see a new show use one in earnest. You're more likely to see some video on the internet somewhere using a laugh track to subvert our expectations by either removing it from a show that uses one.
Oh, I like those sunglasses.
Like 'em, or I'd like to get store credit for that amount, like 'em.
Bye, Napoli.
Or adding one to a show that doesn't merit one.
What good will my sympathies do then?
None, but it is expected of you. Your absence has already been noted.
The boy means nothing to me. Oh, I can't stand the wailing of women.
One word, and I hit you again.
I'm telling Mother!
But before this shift in attitude, virtually every television comedy since the medium's inception used the laugh track, so why are they so hated now? To understand the use of laugh tracks in television, we first need to have a basic understanding of the history of the television sitcom. There is a bit of history of the use of technology similar to the laugh track in radio, but for our purposes today, we'll just be sticking with television. So the TV sitcom, as most of us are familiar, really comes in two packages, the first of which being the single camera method. Single camera means that each scene is shot with only one camera, and various shots within that scene are taken from different angles at different times. They're then stitched together in editing to form a coherent scene. This is how most scripted film and television these days is presented and what we're mostly familiar with. It also allowed for much more varied locations. However, most shows that use a laugh track come from the other school of sitcom, the multi-camera setup. This is the type of show whose popularity was heavily assisted by Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz that features very few locations. Most of these locations would have an open set with the actors cheating themselves toward the mythical fourth wall. But instead of a wall, there are multiple cameras. There's also likely to be something like a live studio audience, but as much as the opening to Cheers would like you to believe it,
Cheers is filmed before a live studio audience.
the live audience really isn't as important as you might think. We'll get to that. But before we get to that, I have a fun fact that I couldn't fit anywhere, so I'm going to put it here because this is my video and you can't control me! God, I really hate myself sometimes. In most early multi-camera sitcoms, there were only 3 cameras, but beginning in the 70s, 4 became more common. And the reason the 4th camera became popular was Robin Williams. I'm serious. In the book Make 'Em Laugh, The Funny Business of America, producer Gary Marshall says that Williams was too crazy for the set and wouldn't stay on his mark, so they hired a 4th camera just to follow him around. And really, that's just the best explanation there could ever be. Since then, 4 cameras has pretty much been the standard for multi-camera shows. Robin Williams, legendary actor, comedian, and trailblazer of television several times over. I was trying to build up a joke there, but that just ended up being facts. Getting back on track, astute observers may have noticed that the multi-camera setup bears a striking resemblance to another form of performance. Unsurprisingly, we're talking about theater. I like to think that this is because people are generally afraid of change, so TV sitcoms took on a form with which people were familiar in order to not seem so new and scary. But in reality, the multicam sitcom's intentions were good-natured, to get people to watch the show in real time and laugh along with the jokes, much like watching a live comedy special. And this isn't isn't a bad or misguided idea at all. Laughter is demonstrably contagious, and there's definitely a psychological suggestion to laugh when you hear others laughing. However, the limitations of the live audience became apparent rather quickly. Things like disrupted sightlines, repeated takes, and general nerves by the audience members meant that more often than not, shows weren't getting quite the laughs that were desired, regardless of the quality of the content. To remedy a lot of this awkwardness, audience reactions would be inserted in post-production in order to better serve the writing. And lots of producers were quite pleased with this advent. So much so that in the 1960s, a huge number of sitcoms ditched the live audience altogether and were shot with a single camera with the laugh track as we know it today inserted to provide audience reactions. By the way, a huge number of these shows relied on the expertise of just one guy to make all of these audience reactions happen. American sound engineer Charles Douglas and his famous, or infamous depending on how you feel, laugh box. During this period, Douglas, along with his one-of-a-kind contraption, became one of the most sought-out technicians in the field of television. So if you want to get mad at someone, light some pitchforks on fire, what the hell am I... This is the guy. But during this time, the multi-camera setup hadn't gone away. It was still kicking and actually experienced a resurgence in the 70s, thanks to shows like All in the Family and The Mary Tyler Moore Show. However, while live audiences were still used, audience reactions were still sweetened, as most of the problems with live audiences hadn't just gone away with time. Those problems were still there, and gaps in audience reactions had to be bridged. And most multi-camera shows since then up to today have done what they can to preserve the studio audience feel, laugh track and all. And by the time the 80s and 90s rolled around, single-camera shows experienced a resurgence of their own, with a notable exception. Some comedy drama shows were airing without the use of any kind of laugh track, which became the fashion for single-camera comedies afterward, with programs like The Larry Sanders Show and Malcolm in the Middle blazing that trail on premium and basic cable respectively. And since then, the single-camera sitcom essentially left the laugh track in the dust. It's nothing more than a relic of a bygone time. So now, here we are. Two kinds of shows with two completely different types of deliveries developed over the course of 6 decades, formulating their own little niches. And with the new golden age of television we're in today, you may have noticed that lots of streaming services or premium networks tend to gravitate towards more cinematic material, which is better suited for the single-camera show. Meanwhile, many basic cable networks tend to stick with the tried and true. And I think that because of this divide, and because new shows on new platforms tend to capture public attention more, people's perception of the multi-camera show, as well as the laugh track, is at an all-time low. Now, despite its troubled, storied, and controversial history, here's why I don't think the laugh track is as bad as people say it is. When bringing up the argument of how laugh tracks are terrible, many single-camera shows are brought up to say, these shows would be worse if they had a laugh track. But that's kind of like saying Super Mario Bros. Would be worse if it were a first-person shooter. To give you an idea of what I mean, watch the Scrubs episode My Life in 4 Cameras, or the 30 Rock episode Live Show. These two single-camera shows' takes on multi-camera setups really showcase the differences in both these formats and highlight that single and multi-camera shows may as well be two completely different genres of television, which they kind of are. One tries to semi-simulate a theater experience, watching something along with other people, without any of the negative effects of actually going to the theater.
Audience participation. Go, 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 go.
While the other tries a much more immersive approach, being shot more cinematically, like a movie, that has much flatter lighting. To me, the comparison between these two formats is a false one because they have two completely different goals in mind. This also applies to when people remove the laugh track from a show that already uses one to highlight how awkward the pauses are. A multi-camera show, much like a theater experience, is a give and take between the audience reaction and the actors' deliveries, something that the cinematically shot single-camera show doesn't have to worry about. Granted, I was a theater kid in high school and college, so those kinds of pauses are normal to me. But if you do think those pauses are awkward and throw off the pacing of the entire show, I'm just gonna assume you've never been to the theater before. Or that you just absolutely hate the theater, which is fine. But the big argument that I always hear about laugh tracks is that people don't like them because people feel that the show is trying to force them to laugh. That the laugh comes off as manipulative, which, first of all, the show isn't forcing anyone to laugh. It's not like it has a gun to your head. Hearing people laugh may suggest what you saw as funny, but it can't change your perception of whether or not it actually was funny to you. Most of these shows are just encouraging laughter from their audience. But I'm not saying that's not manipulative, because it is by definition. But I mean, of course the show is being manipulative. Of course it wants you to laugh. It's a comedy. Film and television are inherently manipulative media that try to elicit an emotional response from its viewers. And while the laugh track, or live audience reactions in general, is a rather antiquated way to go about trying to elicit that reaction, it's only really associated with a very specific kind of show. Most of the television landscape has already left it in the dust, since a lot of comedies now have shifted to a single camera focus, which is fine, that's the wave of the future. And to be perfectly honest in my speculation, citation needed, the over-reliance of laugh tracks, especially on cable shows, is most likely due to people hanging onto this tradition because it's all they know. We're still in the middle of this sort of shift in the media landscape, and some traditionalists are probably still hanging on to laugh tracks and multi-camera shows because they're afraid to march forward into unfamiliar territory. But again, that's not to devalue the importance of the laugh track in certain instances. If you don't like a show because it's too ham-fisted in its laugh track, that's really more of a problem you have with the show itself rather than that laugh track. As a similar example from elsewhere, I found that a lot of Steven Spielberg's film War Horse to be overly manipulative in its mission, especially with regards to the music in certain scenes. So much so that I couldn't even finish the movie. But I don't hold the concept of a musical score responsible for my distaste in that movie. There are other movies with phenomenal scores to them that complement the subject matter perfectly. The combination of elements just didn't work for me in that specific instance. Now, I know that a majority of people will probably say that they don't care whether or not a show has a laugh track. I'm largely in that category myself. But if you're one of those people that says they can't watch any show with a laugh track, or that a show doesn't need a laugh track if it's actually funny, side note, these are not simplified arguments. I've seen both of these before in the real world. You're by extension claiming that the following shows have no worth to you whatsoever. Oh god. Seinfeld, Friends, Blackadder, The IT Crowd, Happy Days, All in the Family, Monty Python's Flying Circus, Frasier, Mr. Bean, That 70s Show, Fawlty Towers, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, MASH, Get Smart, Hogan's Heroes, How I Met Your Mother, Everybody Loves Raymond, most early Hanna-Barbera cartoons, yeah, cartoons with laugh tracks, try to wrap your head around that, Red Dwarf, Cheers, Married with Children, Third Rock from the Sun, Family Ties, you get the picture. There's no shortage of worthwhile shows that implement a laugh track. Now at this point, I'm going to read your mind and assume you're probably saying, this guy is an idiot, which isn't very nice, but you're probably also thinking, well, a lot of those shows use a live studio audience, that's different. But as we've seen, it's only slightly different. Firstly, if a laugh track is done well, you shouldn't be able to tell the difference. And secondly, as we've already discussed, live studio audience laughs are usually sweetened through audio editing techniques using either canned laughter recorded many, many years ago, or additional audio from the audience, usually recorded during another earlier take. At first glance, it sounds like these methods are different, but they're both instances of inserting laughter where there might not have been any before, and it happens way more often than you might think. At the risk of sounding a little condescending to the imaginary straw man I've made out of you, dear viewer, the idea of a laugh track and a studio audience being vastly different things seems to me like a way for us to justify the shows we like while still pretending to hate laugh tracks because it's the cool thing to do these days. One comment I feel like I can foresee to this video is that I'm not actually defending the laugh track, I'm just relating them to good shows that use them and insisting that because of that they must not be bad. I haven't actually made any arguments as to why they're good or how they can actually enhance a show. But I do think that the laugh track, when used correctly, can enhance a show. At this point in time, they're just associated with their own incredibly specific genre of television, which is more than okay. But when used well, they can be used as a tool for timing. It's the most important rule of comedy, and as we've already seen, both single and multi-camera shows have very different deliveries. While single-camera shows allow themselves the freedom of being a little more indie and experimental in the delivery of comedy, the laugh track can serve as punctuation in a multi-camera show. To cherry-pick an example of what I'm talking about, let's use a scene from the Blackadder episode Ink and Incapability. In this scene, Edmund Blackadder is egging on Dr. Samuel Johnson about his new manuscript for the Radical New Dictionary.
This book, sir, contains every word in our beloved language.
Well, every single one, sir?
Every single word, sir.
Oh, well, in that case, sir, I hope you will not object if I also offer the doctor my most enthusiastic contrafibularities.
Each small laugh we hear as Edmund rattles off his various made-up words can be seen almost as a comma, a small break for the audience to process the joke before moving right along to the next one in the very next line.
Contrafibularities, sir? It is a common word down our way. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I'm anaspeptic, phrasmotic, even compunctious to have caused you such pericombobulation.
And the scene, as well as the laughs, build and build until the laughter erupts as Edmund leaves the room.
I shall return interphrastically.
And this moment, when the laughter is at its most raucous, acts as the exclamation point at the end of the exchange. From here, we as the audience get the impression that this bit is over and that the next line will be shifting focus, beginning the next scene. Now once more, here's the full sequence without any of my interrupting or yammering on so you can get a better idea of what I'm talking about.
This book, sir, contains every word in our beloved language.
Every single one, sir?
Every single word, sir.
Oh, well, in that case, sir, I hope you will not object if I also offer the doctor my most enthusiastic contrafibularities. Contrafibularities, sir? It is a common word down our way. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I'm anaspeptic, phrasmotic, even compunctious to have caused you such pericombobulation.
What are you all about, Blackhead? This is all beginning to sound a bit like Dago talk to me.
I'm sorry, sir. I merely wished to congratulate the doctor on not having left out a single word. Shall I fetch the tea, Your Highness?
Yes, yes. And get that damn fire up here, will you?
Certainly, sir. I shall return interphrastically.
So, Dr. Johnson, sit you down. Now, this book of yours. Tell me, what's it all about?
Of course, this isn't something we think about consciously, but the laugh track does its part to act as a guiding hand, directing our attention just as the camera work does. I'll give you another example. This time, we'll be looking at the episode of the IT Crowd, The Work Outing. Honestly, if you haven't seen this episode, I recommend going to watch it before continuing with this video. It really is one of the best half hours of comedy. So anyway, if you're still here, or paused this video and then went to go watch the episode and then came back, here's our context. Our heroes, Roy and Moss, have tagged along with their coworker Jen to the theater. Roy gets caught up in some shenanigans and ends up lying about being disabled. It's a long story. Meanwhile, Moss gets mistaken for an employee, and then we don't see him again for almost 5 minutes. And with just how much happens in this episode, that's an eternity. Here is the next time we see Moss, which occurs just after Jen discovers Roy masquerading in his own charade.
He's had quite an evening. Someone stole his wheelchair.
Really? Did you see who it was?
Red-bearded man.
Uh-huh. How long have you been disabled?
10 years?
10 years. And how did it happen, if that's not a rude question?
Acid.
What are the chances of that happening?
100 to 1.
You look like you could do with a drink.
Whiskey. Please, double.
Excuse me.
Yes, miss.
Okay.
If you've never seen this moment beforehand, that yes miss hits you like a f***ing brick wall. It still gets me every single time. And the laugh track supports it. It's one of the biggest laughs in the episode, not only mirroring just how surprised Jen is, but how surprised the audience is as well. On top of that, it also provides a really stark contrast to Richard Ayoade's subdued delivery of the line. Without that wall of sound to smack you in the face, this moment wouldn't have been nearly as impactful. And when timing out the scene, the build up to that laugh is monumental. There's a longish, low-key exchange between Jen and Roy with some small to medium laughs peppered throughout before we're absolutely knocked off our feet with just 2 innocuous words. In these examples, I honestly don't think it's unfair to say that the proper use of the laugh track can definitely enhance the experiences of the shows that use them. To me, it's not really too different than, say, the many ways music can be used in a musical, or how a musical score can punctuate a scene as well. A laugh track can't fix a bad script, but a laugh track can make good writing great. Look, I'm not going to pretend that there are 0 laugh tracks out there that are obnoxious. That would just be silly of me to claim. Even very early in their adoption, there may have been too much of an over-reliance to them. It's always been a bit of a touchy subject. But what some people out there need to realize is that the current perception of laugh tracks is actually very similar to the argument that computer-generated images were taking over Hollywood a few years ago. Both CG and laugh tracks are nothing more than tools at the disposal of the filmmaker, depending on what they set out to do in their work. And when handled correctly, both can be used totally effectively. What actually happens is that we mainly notice and berate bad uses or over-dependence of these things, which leads to the negative public perception we have of both of these elements today. To quote Futurama, a cartoon without a laugh track for anybody keeping score at home, the golden rule for laugh tracks, CGI, and virtually everything in the film and television industries is,
when you do things right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all.
And look, if you still unconditionally hate laugh tracks even after watching this, that's fine. You're more than entitled to your opinion, and I do know some people that actually can't watch shows with laugh tracks. I just hope now you understand a bit better where they've come from, why they're still used, and why I don't actually think they're the worst thing ever. I already earned that title in 1992, and I have no interest in giving it up.